Good afternoon and welcome to the Narrow Path radio broadcast. My name is Steve Gregg and we're live for an hour each weekday afternoon. We have an open phone line for you to call if you have questions about the Bible or the Christian faith, or if you happen to disagree with the host on any particular point and would like to discuss that, you can call about that too. The number to call is 844-484-5737. That's 844-484-5737. And we're going to go right to the phones and talk to, looks like it's going to be Richard from Seal Beach, California. Richard, welcome to the Narrow Path. Thanks for calling.
Yeah, Steve, I was just wondering, how many hours do you think Jesus spent in the grave after he died?
I don't know.
Because if he rose early on the first day of the week, and the first day of the week begins at sundown, he could have arisen at 7 p.m., and that would mean he spent 26 hours in the grave. And according to Psalm 16, his body would not see corruption, so that would fulfill that prediction about the Messiah. Have you ever thought about that?
I've never been overly concerned about the number of hours he was in the grave. There are different explanations of how many days he was in the grave. Of course, the Bible said he would rise on the third day, and it says that numerous times. And then, of course, Jesus himself said that as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the fish, so shall the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. And it's always been an interesting thing to try to calculate which days he was in the grave, because obviously if he was crucified on Friday and rose anytime Sunday, that would be maybe parts of 3 days, but it'd only be 2 nights. And so people have come up with different theories. Some believe Jesus was crucified on Thursday. Some think he was crucified on Wednesday. And of course, if they're right about that, well, then the number of hours in the grave would be quite different. And again, when he rose, you're right. I mean, the first day of the week to the Jew begins at sundown on Sabbath. That'd be Saturday at sundown around 6 o'clock. And so if he had risen at what we call Saturday evening after dawn, after sundown, I should say, well, then that would still be early the first day of the week from the Jewish way of reckoning. So we don't know when he rose. We know his tomb was empty early Sunday morning when the women came to look at it. But as far as even the exact day he was crucified, traditionally it's Friday, but many people have made cases based on when Passover was in different years, and that can be calculated now, that it might have been Wednesday or Thursday. I've never really cared. Which means I really haven't thought much about it, because it's not the kind of thing I've ever been motivated to devote much attention to. The fact that he died and rose again is obviously extremely important. How many hours in the grave is not as important.
But did those days, like Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, did they exist at that time?
Well, they didn't call them by those names, no, but they did have. I mean, there have been 24-hour days since the creation of the world, and there's been, weeks made up of 7 24-hour days since the creation of the world. So, what the Jews they would call Sunday. They wouldn't call it Sunday. Maybe the heathen would, but the Jews would call Sunday the first day of the week, and Monday the second day of the week, and so forth, all the way through till you got the seventh day, which is Sabbath or Saturday. So they didn't call them by the names that we use.
Okay, but his body did not see corruption, so it couldn't have rotted.
Right, he did not rot. Well, he was he was not embalmed in any sophisticated sense of the word, but his body was wrapped in a cool place. And although, if he was in the good tomb for, let's say, parts of 2 days, well, already, I think decay probably begins the moment a person dies, but it doesn't progress very far in the first day or two if it's kept cool and so forth. So, his body did not reach complete decay. There might have been some portions of his organs that had begun to slightly decay, as would be impossible to avoid with any dead organism, any dead human.
Yes, he was anointed with oils and spices. Now, when the women came to the grave, they had more oil and spices. How did they figure to get past the stone?
Well, they were actually asking themselves that same question. As you read the story in Matthew 27, it says, as they approached the tomb, they were asking among themselves how they were going to move the stone. I think they were just hoping that they might have some assistance, or that they might be, among them, there were 3 or 4 women, that maybe among them they might have the strength combined to move it. I'm not sure if they're thinking very specifically, or maybe even very rationally, about the subject. I think they may have been more emotional in their interest in going to anoint the body, and kind of just hoping that some way or another they'd move the stone. But it was a problem that they considered, because the Bible says they were actually discussing that among themselves as they came. All right, I need to take another call, but I hope that those points are helpful to you in some way. I appreciate your call. Thanks for joining us. Scott from Roseville, California. Welcome to the Narrow Path.
Good morning, Steve, and
Hi.
to the spirit that has obviously been bestowed upon you.
So what can we do for you today, brother?
Well, now, I am confounded by the new modern ways we have of committing old sins. And so I have questions in regards to gluttony.
And what are those questions?
Oh, yes. Now, with modern technology and, in another language, it's sonic bell, I can have all my fat sucked out and removed until I get fat again, and it kills me, because, sin is the road to death. So now that it's changed, it's the same old sin, but do I need 2 services? One for my loved ones to wish me well, and the other one, or do I just bribe the trash can? What are your views on these new ways of dealing with gluttony and other things?
Wait, before you go any further, I'm not sure I understand the connection between the first part of your statement and the question you asked. You said something about you. Wait, no, let me see if I can somehow round up your thoughts here.
Yes, sir.
So you said that you can be gluttonous without becoming fat, because technologically they can suck the fat out of your body, so you can eat like a glutton but not look like a glutton. But then you had something to do with, what do they do with your body or something like that? How is that related to you?
Oh, no, you have a burial service, so your loved ones can wish you well, but with such a large, you don't do it for your fingernails or your haircuts, but if a huge portion of you that is, definitely something you're going to be accountable for and should repent for, do you need to account for, that part just being sucked away? Aren't you still accountable for that gluttony that they just bribe the trash man for?
So in other words, if the amount of fat they suck out of you is it amounts to a large percentage of your body weight, then does that mean that it's like there's 2 of you? Of course not. No, I mean, fat is not a human being. If you lose an arm, you don't have a separate burial for your arm, then you have for your body later on. No, there's only one you, and there may be any parts of your body that are lost in the course of your lifetime, but it's as long as you're breathing and moving and your heart's beating, you're still alive and you're the same person. You're just somewhat reduced by the loss. I appreciate your call. Let's talk to Don from Snohomish, Washington. Don, welcome to the Narrow Path. Thanks for calling.
Hi, Steve. Thanks for taking my call. I have 2 questions that are related. First off, in John 20:17, Jesus told Mary not to cling to him because he had not ascended. Mm-hmm. But then just 10 verses later, it says, in the same day, he tells Thomas to reach your finger here and look at my hands, reach your hand here, put it into my side. So my 2 questions are, first, why did Jesus tell Mary not to cling to him? And, of course, it does say because he's not ascended yet. And then the same day, tell Thomas to reach your finger here. And the second question, which is related, is a teaching I just recently heard. Did Jesus go to heaven, sprinkle his blood on the mercy seat in heaven, and return to earth? And I see the justification being used as Hebrews 9:11 through 14, where it talks about Jesus as a high priest with a greater and more perfect tabernacle not made with hands.
Right, and so he's the high priest who sprinkled his blood in the Holy of Holies in heaven, correct? Well, let me just see if I can work through both parts of your question. First of all, a correction. When he spoke to Thomas and said, here, put your finger in my hand, in the holes, That was not the same day. It is the same chapter. It's the same chapter in John, but 8 days had passed. Thomas was not present even later when after Jesus appeared to Mary Magdalene and told her not to cling to him. He did then appear to the other disciples in the upper room, but Thomas was not there. And it was 8 days later that he appeared with Thomas present and invited Thomas to touch his hands and see that it was really him. So there was a gap of 8 days. But you're asking about what really happened between those two things, whether it was later the same day or whether it was a week later. I would point out that that same morning, probably moments later after Jesus told Mary not to cling to him, according to Matthew's parallel of the account, Jesus actually encountered the other women who had been at the tomb and were on their way to tell the disciples that the tomb was empty and that Jesus had risen. And so this could only be, minutes apart from the time that Jesus told Mary not to cling to him, that he actually encountered these other women and let them, it says they held his feet as an act of adoration, and he did not tell them not to touch him. In the King James Version, the statement of Jesus to Mary Magdalene is, "Do not touch me," or "touch me not, for I have not yet ascended to my Father." And the modern translations have correctly retranslated that, "Do not cling to me, because I have yet to ascend to my Father." So the idea here is he's addressing Mary's, affection for him, for one thing, and the fact that that affection translates into clinging to him in a manner which would suggest that she's going to remain emotionally dependent on his nearness, on his physical presence, as she had been before he died. You see, she had been very close to him, along with many other disciples, before his death, and she missed him so much and had assumed he was gone when he died, of course, and then seen him alive again. You can just imagine how, if you've loved someone, maybe a spouse or a child who's died, and you're just trying to work through the crisis that you've lost this loved one, and then you see them alive a few days later and they're back. I mean, you're going to be grabbing them, you're going to be holding on to them, you're going to say, "Hey, I'm never going to take you for granted. I'm never going to let you go again." And he's saying, "Hey, Mary, don't do that. Don't cling to me, because I am going away again. I'm going again more long term. You've been away from me for a few days, and now I'm back. I'm sure you want to hold on to me, but the truth is you can't. I'm going to ascend." And I think he's referring in that sense not to going to heaven that same day to sprinkle his blood on the mercy seat in heaven, but rather to his eventual ascension 40 days later, which was, of course, witnessed by all the disciples. So I think he's simply predicting that he's not back for good. He's only back for a little while, so she should not be too clingy to him, because he's going to have to go away again. But that going away, I believe, is a reference to that which he did 6 weeks later, when he ascended and never came back. But it was announced he will come back someday. But Mary didn't live to see that, nor the disciples, nor have we so far. Now, as far as the statement of Hebrews chapter 9, that Jesus, like the high priest, went into the Holy of Holies and sprinkled his blood on the altar, this is true. But when people mistakenly think that this refers to something he did immediately after he rose from the dead, that is the suggestion that some have made, and what you're alluding to, is that when Jesus saw Mary and said, "Don't touch me," or "Don't cling to me, I have yet to ascend to my Father," that what he was saying is, "I've just come out of my grave. I have to immediately go up to heaven and do something. I'll be back, and then I can be touched after that." That's what most people think he's saying. I don't think he's saying that. I think he's just saying, "Don't cling to me, because I am going to go away again." Now, it's not that he can't be touched, because he did let Judas touch him. He let the women touch him. He let all the disciples touch him. And he even let Mary touch him. But he just said, "Don't cling to me," and that has to do with more her emotional clinging, I think, than the physical. But the point that I'm making is that when Hebrews says he went up to the mercy seat in heaven, it's referring to his ascension 40 days after his resurrection. And this is likened to Yom Kippur and the ritual of the high priest going into the Holy of Holies, which he did every year on Yom Kippur, and offering animal blood on the mercy seat within the Holy of Holies, and then coming out again. Now, this all happened on Yom Kippur annually in the Jewish calendar in all within a few hours' time on a single day. However, its activity is compared in Hebrews 9 with Jesus going into heaven when he ascended, and the fact that he is interceding for us right now in heaven. He has not come out of the Holy of Holies yet. He went in when he ascended, and he will come out again. You find this at the end of Hebrews 9, talking about how we are waiting for him to appear a second time. That is, he's going to come out just like the Jews waited for the high priest to come out of the Holy of Holies after he'd gone in there. We're still waiting for Jesus to come back, the writer of Hebrews says. So what the writer of Hebrews is suggesting is that the activity of the high priest in the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur corresponds in principle with Jesus' present session in heaven since he ascended and until he comes back. His whole absence, the past 2,000 years, corresponds in principle with the time of the high priest, who was only maybe for a few minutes or hours in the Jewish ritual in the Holy of Holies. And during this entire time of Christ's absence, he is making intercession for the church. And that is what the high priest did in the Holy of Holies for Israel's sake. So this is how that is being connected, in my opinion, by the writer of Hebrews. I hope that helps. Okay, Betty from Sacramento, California, welcome to The Narrow Path. Thanks for calling.
Thank you. I have a question. It troubles me. My granddaughter is married to a guy that is not the best, I'd put it that way. And he's into pornography. And in my mind, I'm just questioning whether or not pornography is considered adultery. And, if she were to part from him, is that a scriptural reason?
Is she looking for grounds for divorce?
No.
Okay, so
at
you're
point,
interested.
She's very much into denial. She's very much.
But are you telling me that you're somewhat interested in her getting a divorce, but she's not the one interested in getting a divorce? Is that correct?
I'm just wondering. Wondering.
Right. Well, I would not recommend divorce to anybody unless there was a very dangerous situation in remaining married. Whether pornography is the same as adultery or not, I'd have to say at one level it certainly is, because Jesus said if a man looks at a woman to lust after her, and that certainly is what men are doing when they're looking at pornography, says he commits adultery with her in his heart. So that's a heart issue. He also says, though, in the same passage, that if a man is angry at his brother without cause, it's similar to committing murder. Now, in the sight of God, but not in the sight of the courts. In other words, you can't take a person to court because he got angry and convict him of murder, because that was in his heart. The courts and other people cannot adjudicate sins that remain in the heart. They are sins, and God, a person will have to answer to God for them. But when it comes to human penalties, we do not penalize through the courts people who have been angry, even though Jesus said it's like murder as far as God's concerned. Likewise, we do not penalize through the courts people who have lust in their hearts, even though in God's sight it's like adultery. It's like it in terms of the impurity of it and how God disapproves of it. But it's not like it in exactly the amount of damage it does to other people and society and so forth. That's why the courts can only really adjudicate matters that have to do with people's actions, not what they're thinking. In a sense, the use of pornography, insofar as it involves mental adultery, is a thought crime, just like anger in God's sight is a thought crime. But the courts are not authorized to punish people for thought crimes. They will have to answer for them before God at God's judgment, not ours. So, I don't really know that any marriage would be safe if Christianity adopted a position that a woman can divorce any husband who is known to be having lustful thoughts toward other women. I mean, it's a horrible thing, I'm sure, for a woman to think of her husband doing so. Well, looking at things, whether you're looking at pornography or just going down to the beach and looking at women having the same kinds of thoughts, it's the same thought crime. Now, of course, it's very offensive, and understandably so, and it's offensive to God too. But in terms of whether it rises to the level of grounds for divorce, I'm not prepared to give that kind of permission. Now, when people think of what Jesus said about divorce, he said that, of course, it's not okay to divorce your spouse, and he did give the exception, except for the cause of fornication. Now, fornication is a reference to sexual activity outside the marriage, and that would include physical adultery or physical, I don't know, bestiality or incest or things like that. Any kind of sexual crime which involves sexual activity falls under the general word in Greek of porneia, which is translated fornication. In the King James, it's translated sexual immorality in most modern translations. So porneia, which is what Jesus suggests may be grounds for divorce, is, I don't know of any time that it's used without referring to actual activity. That is, there is such a thing as adultery, which is porneia, because it is a physical act of porneia where a man is sleeping with a woman who's not his wife. But I don't know of any case where porneia is used, to speak of thoughts. And Jesus didn't say that the man who lusts after another woman has committed porneia in his heart, but adultery in his heart. Of course, it's an awful thing to commit adultery in their heart or otherwise. But I think we need to be committed to restoration as much as we can be in marriages. And it's true, some people make very foolish choices in whom they marry, or they make a choice that's not obviously foolish, but the person they marry kind of deteriorates into something really bad. And this is why, frankly, when we take vows to get married, we say, I'm going to stay with you for better or for worse until we're both dead. And so I really believe that people should stay in their marriages. Of course, if a marriage is miserable, that doesn't mean they should just grin and bear it. They should work on it. They should do what they can to resolve it. Now, the man himself, if he's really such a scoundrel, and he may well be, he may leave the marriage himself someday. He may get involved in physical adultery someday. If it comes to that, I would see the case differently. I'm not the least bit minimizing the sinfulness of looking at pornography. I'm just saying it's not the same sin that Jesus, I think, is referring to when he talks about fornication. That's my opinion. You could get another opinion from someone else, I'm sure, but that would be my opinion about your question.
Okay, well, thank you for your...
All right. Yeah, I know when you've got relatives that you love and they've married badly, you may cherish secret hopes that their spouse will die or that they'll get a divorce or something like that. And, sometimes that is what will happen. And sometimes if it does happen, it leads to a better situation. But we should, I think, place all of our energies into trying to save the marriage, not just make them stay together, but cause them to work out their differences in such a way that they don't have these kinds of crises in their marriage. Do they have any children?
2.
That's all the more reason to be concerned about saving the marriage if possible. The children of divorced families, no matter what the cause of the divorce, statistically, the children are in a much higher risk group for criminal behavior, antisocial behavior.
They're high risk staying in a situation like that where...
Well, there's risk there too.
They probably know what's going on,
They probably do, and I'm not saying it's I'm not saying it's not a bad situation. What I'm saying is that statistically, children who will come from homes where there's divorce are much higher risk than in homes that stay together for much activity, including immorality, including pornography, including criminal behavior, including suicide and drug abuse and things like that. So, so it's something that it's an ugly thing when people aren't following God and when married people are not following God. But our greatest hope should be not that their marriage fails, but that they would both come to be followers of God at some point, in which case that marriage can be a good thing for them and for the children and for the glory of God. I appreciate your call.
Okay. Well, thank you. It's complicated.
Okay. God bless you. It is complicated. Divorce and remarriage, or just marriage itself. Very, very complicated situations, because God didn't make them to be trivial. God made them to be holy, to be a picture of himself and his church. And there's nothing more holy in God's mind than that particular relationship. And so when God created marriage, he made it to be a picture of that. And therefore, it's not a light thing. We take it lightly in our modern society. It is not a light thing. You must not divorce, except, as I say, in extreme situations where it may be dangerous to remain in the marriage. And sometimes it is. But, you really need to be committed to making a marriage work if possible. We're going to take a break here and come back. We have another half hour ahead. But at this point every day, I'd just like to remind our audience that we are a listener-supported ministry. Sometimes you might take for granted the fact that a radio program is free to listen to on the radio, but it's not free to be on the radio. We have to pay for the time. If you'd like to help us pay for that time, you can write to The Narrow Path, P.O. Box 1730, Temecula, California, 92593. Or you can do it from our website, thenarrowpath.com. Stay tuned for 30 seconds. I'll be right back.
Small is the gate and narrow is the path that leads to life. We're proud to welcome you to The Narrow Path with Steve Gregg. Steve has nothing to sell you today, but everything to give you. When today's radio show is over, we invite you to visit thenarrowpath.com, where you'll find topical audio teachings, blog articles, verse-by-verse teachings, and the archives of all the radio shows. Study, learn, and enjoy. We thank you for supporting the listener-supported Narrow Path with Steve Gregg.
Welcome back to the Narrow Path radio broadcast. My name is Steve Gregg, and we are live for another half hour with open phone lines for you to call if you have questions about the Bible or about the Christian life. Or if you have a different viewpoint from the host, you can call this number. It's 844-484-5737. That's 844-484-5737. Just one announcement. Once in a while, not very often, but once in a while I announce that we are having a school aboard ship in September. And this school is going to be 12 days long, 30 hours of lectures through the book of Acts by yours truly. I'm going to be teaching verse by verse through the book of Acts in depth on a cruise to Alaska from Los Angeles, to and from Los Angeles. This cruise, we charge nothing for it. That is, I'm not going to be paid for anything for it, but you'd have to pay for the cruise just like we do. I'm going to pay for the cruise, and everyone else who's going is paying for the cruise. It's not cheap to go on a cruise, but it's not an extremely expensive one. And, of course, many people would like to go on a cruise to Alaska and also like to go to an intensive Bible course, and this would be an occasion to kill two birds with one stone. Now, we have a number of people who have signed up and are planning to go. It's in September. Was it from September 17th to the 29th or something like that? And we just learned yesterday of a friend of ours, a male, a single male, a widower, who would like to go on it, but the cruise, has cabins for two. And so the price per person is based on the idea that there's two people in a cabin. Now, at this point, I believe we have an even number of people coming, which means all the cabins, all the people have a roommate. This brother would like to have a roommate. He'd like to go. He can't afford, of course, to pay for the whole cabin. He'd have to pay two fares then. But if we have any single men, and he's an older man like myself, if you'd like to go on the cruise and become his roommate, that'd be great. He's a wonderful Christian man. Anyway, we just heard from him yesterday that he'd like to do that. And so I'm just letting our listeners know, if you've been thinking about it, maybe you're a single guy and you've been contemplating it and kind of, maybe not. Well, maybe this will tip the scales and you'll want to join us. You can go to our website, The Narrow Path. And by the way, women are welcome to sign up too. There's still plenty of room for women and men both to sign up, and couples. You can go to thenarrowpath.com and go to the tab that says Announcements, and you'll get as much information as you need to become a participant in this. I'm looking forward to it. Not even so much because I've never been to Alaska or on a cruise. I've never been on a cruise or to Alaska, nor has it ever been, on my bucket list necessarily. But I'm excited to have a dedicated 12 days to have 30 hours teaching through the book of Acts. But the lectures will not interfere with any of the shore activities. The days where we're entirely at sea will have more lecture time. The days that there's shore activities, the lectures will not conflict with those schedules. So that way you get the benefits of the cruise and of all the lectures without having to choose between the two. All right. Anyway, just thought I'd let you know because our brother would like to have a roommate, and we'd love to have him be able to come along. Don from Snohomish, Washington was an earlier call, and apparently he had a follow-up after we were done, so he wants to call back in. Hello, Don. Welcome.
Hi, Steve. I'm going to focus on, does the Bible clearly and explicitly teach that Jesus literally went to heaven and sprinkled his blood on the mercy seat in heaven? And I'm looking at Hebrews 9. I'm just going to read a phrase out of it. With his own blood, he entered the most holy place. And then Hebrews 12, where it says, Jesus, the mediator of the new covenant, and to the blood of the sprinkling. And that seems to be the two strongest verses pointing to that. But my understanding was that the propitiation was done on the cross. And it seems like these verses in Hebrews 9 and 12 are symbolic. And I did a lot of reading this morning, and I see a lot of people teach that those are symbolic, that Jesus did not literally go to heaven. John MacArthur is one example. And I just want to get your view. Did he literally enter heaven and sprinkle his blood on the mercy seat in heaven?
Well, I'm surprised to hear that about John MacArthur, because he's usually more orthodox on most points. Where does he think Jesus went when he ascended?
Well, to heaven, but I'm talking specifically about spreading his blood on the mercy, sprinkling his blood on the mercy
seat. Well, that this could be symbolic is not impossible. I mean, I don't really know that it makes a great deal of difference whether we take it literally or symbolically. The point is that he's making a connection with the practice of Yom Kippur, which was when the high priest interceded for and atoned for the sins of Israel for the year. And the writer of Hebrews in chapter 9 is saying that's what Jesus has done for us. Now, whether there's a literal mercy seat and he actually took, red blood corpuscles that had been in his veins previously and sprinkled them on that seat in heaven, and whether he's wearing a high priest outfit and things like that, I have no idea. It's not important to me to know. The point that the writer of Hebrews wants us to know is that the shadow that is reflected in the Yom Kippur ritual has its fulfillment in Christ, our high priest, whose own blood now appeals for us. Now, whether this is literal or symbolic, I can't say. I see no reason why it couldn't be literal, because the language of Hebrews does not give a clue at any point that this is symbolic. On the other hand, it wouldn't have to give a clue for it to be symbolic. It could be symbolic, and he's just, speaking of the symbolism, but we don't have any real information to decide that matter or to tip the scales, in my opinion. Now, you're saying Jesus' atonement of us was on the cross. That's true, but the cross and the resurrection and the ascension and the enthronement of Christ in the New Testament gospel is treated like one complex event. True, in terms of those living through it, they happen on different days. Jesus died on one day, he rose another day, ascended another day into heaven. But when the gospel is preached by the apostles in the book of Acts, they speak of the whole thing, the death, resurrection, and ascension of Christ, as one transaction. So to say Jesus atoned for our sins on the cross, and then to say, and he appeals for us and intercedes for us in heaven as a high priest on the basis of his shed blood, would not really be contrary to each other any more than we say that when the high priest on Yom Kippur sacrificed the bull on the altar outside the Holy of Holies, that sacrifice was the atoning sacrifice for the day. And then he took the blood in and applied it to the mercy seat, which applied that, that atonement to the people. It's all one transaction. In the case of the Day of Atonement, it took probably a few hours to go through all the things. In the case of Jesus' death, resurrection, and ascension, it was a few days, but still it was one extended transaction. So I don't think that, if it is true that Jesus literally sprinkled blood on the mercy seat in heaven, in other words, if the writer of Hebrews is using a literal description of what really happened beyond the veil where we can't see, well, that wouldn't contradict the idea that the atonement was made on the cross. It would just be suggesting that that atonement which was made on the cross was applied to our case when sprinkled in heaven. But if you have reason to believe it's symbolic, I wouldn't be interested in refuting that because I don't have any problem with this being symbolic language. We do believe that Jesus is our high priest. The main thing the writer of Hebrews is saying is that while Christ is in heaven, that is, after he ascended and until he comes back, he is there interceding for us. Now, it's not literally like the high priest in the Old Testament because we're told throughout Scripture that Jesus is seated at the right hand of God in heaven, whereas the writer of Hebrews points out in chapter 10 that the high priest on Yom Kippur in the Jewish temple and tabernacle, he never sat down. There's no chair in the Holy of Holies. So he just went in and he was continually standing year by year doing this thing. And the writer of Hebrews makes the point in Hebrews 10 that this shows that the sacrifices and atoning work of the high priest in the Old Testament never was complete. They never could retire from it easily because what they did one year would have to be redone the next year, and they never really rest from it. It's an ongoing work. But then the writer of Hebrews in chapter 10 makes the contrast. But Jesus offered himself one time and then sat down. In other words, he doesn't have to do it year by year. So there are differences as well as similarities to Jesus' work in heaven and that of the high priest in the Holy of Holies. The writer of Hebrews is not necessarily saying that everything is precisely the same. And therefore, you may have a good reason to say that the description of Jesus actually sprinkling blood and so forth is simply symbolic, showing a connection and a similarity in that the high priest doing that in the Holy of Holies was like applying the blood of the sacrifice to the forgiveness of the people, and Jesus does the same thing by his seated at the right hand of God intercession for his people, which is based on the merits of his blood. I have no firm conviction one way or the other, but if you want to think of it as a symbolic thing, I would not oppose that. All right, let's talk to Jennifer from Dallas, Texas. Jennifer, welcome to the Narrow Path. Thanks for calling.
Yes, I stumbled upon this program years back, and I'm so glad I did. I really enjoy this program. A few weeks ago, you commented of something that really has bothered me because I apply scriptures to Jennifer. Jeremiah 29:11 is one of the favorite ones that get strength from, and I didn't know that we couldn't apply. Of course, I know it's nothing 70 years. I know the story,
yeah.
But I know the plans I have for you, and I just applied that to me. So, and I'm hoping I'm going to hang up and listen that you can tell me that I can apply that to me. Okay, I'm going to listen.
Okay, Jennifer, thank you for your call. So, God says in Jeremiah, in a letter that Jeremiah writes to the captive Israelites, the captive Judeans who were taken into Babylon, he writes an encouraging letter in which he encourages them to settle in and plan to be there a long time and seek the peace of their captors and the land they are in. And he also says, very famously, which people like to quote, he says, I know the plans I have for you. God says to these exiles in Babylon, he says, I know the plans that I have for you. They're plans of peace. They're good things. He's basically saying, it's verse 11. He says, I know the thoughts that I think toward you. Some translations say the plans. It says the Lord, thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you a future and a hope. So many Christians have thought, that's a very that's a nice promise. I think I'll claim that for myself. And you're asking, is that okay? Because really, it's not a promise that's made to Christians per se, or to you personally anywhere in the Bible, and therefore, is it legitimate? Now, I have to say that there are promises in the Old Testament to certain people that would not be applicable to us. For example, God told Abraham, I'm going to, I'm going to make you the father of a multitude, and through your seed, all the nations are going to be blessed. Well, I can't say that's a promise. I'm going to have a multitude of children, and my children are going to bless the whole world. And that's a personal promise to Abraham. It's not to everybody. It was a unique thing. Likewise, there are promises God made to Israel that are unique to the Old Covenant, which would be, like in Deuteronomy 28, if you keep my laws, if you keep my statutes and do what I command you, then I'll bless everything about your life. You'll never have miscarriages. You'll never have, famine, circumstances, droughts. You'll live long and you'll be prosperous and all that. I don't believe those promises are New Covenant promises. Those are Old Covenant promises. So we have to be careful about trying to apply promises to us that really belong to somebody else. But there are promises that are made to people other than ourselves, which reflect a settled commitment on God's part toward his people. And his people are us now. And I would say that whatever God says that is generically true about his faithful people can reasonably be applied to Christians about the same thing. Now, true, the passage you're talking about, Jeremiah 29:11, is specifically to a group of people in Israel, in Babylon, who are Israelites, and it's not addressed to anybody else. But it reflects God's character and his commitment to his people. And I would say it's similar in terms of our application to ourselves to, for example, Joshua 1:8, I think it is, where God says to Joshua, I will never leave you nor forsake you. But the writer of Hebrews quotes that and says that God has promised. He says, we can confidently say the Lord is my helper because God has said, I will never leave you or forsake you. Notice that the statement that God made to Joshua, personally, a personal statement, is in a sense said to be something we can count on. And that's where the writer of Hebrews tells us not to be covetous. And I'm talking about Hebrews chapter 13, verse 5. Let your conduct be without covetousness, and be content with such things as you have. For he himself has said, I will never leave you, nor forsake you. So we may boldly say, the Lord is my helper. I will not fear what men can do to me. Now, what's interesting is the statement, I will not leave you, nor forsake you, as I said, comes from Joshua 1. It's actually verse 5. A promise he made to Joshua. And then the other thing he says that we may boldly say, the Lord is my helper, I will not fear what can man do to me. That's also a promise that the psalmist makes or recognizes as for him in Psalm 118, verse 6. So the writer of Hebrews quotes two different promises from the Old Testament, one to an individual and one to, no doubt, God's people in general, and says that Christians can claim those. So it says in 2 Corinthians, I believe it's in chapter 1, verse 10, that Paul said in Christ, all the promises of God are yea and amen in Christ through us. And that, of course, that has to be understood within a certain range of all, because, as I said, personal promises made to Abraham are not necessarily applicable to me, or promises they made to Joseph or to Jacob or whatever. But promises that are made to that reflect God's commitment to his people in general. God has not changed, and therefore when we read his promise to those people, it resonates in the sense that we say, well, I'm his people too, and that's the same God, and I can claim this promise for myself. So I would say that when people read Jeremiah 29:11 and they say, I want to apply that to me, can I do it? I would say it's that kind of a statement. It's that kind of statement that tells us what God's attitude is and what his heart is, and he doesn't change. So, yeah, I would be comfortable with that. Some people might not, but some people are kind of, legalistic about applying promises to anyone other than who they were specifically made to. And you do need to be careful about that in some situations. But it's clear that the New Testament writers think that some of these promises made in the Old Testament are promises we should claim and that we should live by. So that, I hope, answers your question sufficiently. Melissa from Phoenix, Arizona, welcome to the Narrow Path. Thanks for calling.
Hi, Steve. I have a question in regard to Word of Faith movement.
Mm-hmm.
I have myself been healed of something incurable. My friends pray for people. They see healing.
Wonderful.
However, I have been struggling with something for about 2 years now, and I guess I feel condemnation and guilt because I have now decided, well, if God's not answering my prayer, I'll just do it myself and start going to doctors and taking supplements and all of that. But I feel badly about it because I know healing is real. I've experienced it. I've seen it. And I guess because they say if you don't have faith, you're not getting healed. So I wonder if it's me.
Well, this is the one of the great dangers of the Word of Faith movement, is it makes sick people feel guilty about the fact that they can't get well, as if it's their fault. It's not your fault if you can't get well. Yeah, I believe in healing too. I actually believe that I was healed of an incurable disease when I was a child. I can't prove it, and it's not part of my, I wouldn't insist upon it, but I was diagnosed with cystic fibrosis, which is incurable, when I was 2 years old, and I don't have that now. I was prayed for by my parents and family, and that disease does not exist in me right now. So either I was misdiagnosed or I was healed, one or the other, and I'm willing to believe either one because I believe God does heal, but I don't believe he promises to always heal. And this is where I differ from the Word of Faith people. They believe there's a generic promise of healing for everyone who has enough faith. Well, if that's true, then if you don't get yourself healed, then you don't have enough faith to be healed, and it's your fault. But more than that, they say that healing is part of the atonement, which I don't agree with either, that Jesus bought our healing just as he bought the forgiveness of our sins, and that both our healing and the forgiveness of sins are ours through faith. Well, if that's true, and it's my fault that I can't get healed, and Jesus bought that for me, then what makes me think I can obtain forgiveness of sins, which he also bought for me, which is to be obtained the same way? I can actually see if I'm healed or not. I can't see if I'm forgiven. Therefore, if I'm told by the same faith I'm forgiven and healed, and I can see that I don't have enough faith to be healed, that would almost translate into a suggestion I don't have enough faith to be forgiven either. And that's why this is such a horrible doctrine. Do you know there was one church by Hobart Freeman was a Word of Faith pastor who had a congregation, and over 90 people in his church died of sicknesses that could have been easily treated and cured, but because his teaching was that if you go to a doctor, you don't have faith. Well, where does the Bible say that? Jesus said, those who are well don't need a physician, but those who are sick. So Jesus indicated that sick people do need a physician. And you might say, but Jesus healed people and they didn't need a physician. True, if he heals you, then you don't need a physician. But in general, sick people need a physician. Healing is unusual. It's not, I'm not saying it doesn't happen a lot of times, but it doesn't happen most of the time. And the Bible does not give any reason to believe that it should, because miraculous healing is not what Jesus' message is about. His message was about the kingdom of God, and the healings he did, and still sometimes does, are simply signs that the kingdom has come. Remember when he healed the man who was paralyzed, he said, so that you might know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins, I'm going to heal this man. So he healed him in order to show something that you couldn't see otherwise, namely that Jesus had the authority to forgive. And, Paul had a thorn in the flesh. Of course, the Word of Faith people say it wasn't a sickness. And they say that simply because they can't allow that Paul, a man of great faith and power, would ever be sick. But he was. In both Galatians 5 and in 2 Corinthians 12, he mentions his infirmity. He calls it an infirmity. In the Greek, that's the same word that is found in the statement, Jesus himself took our infirmities, which the Word of Faith people use to prove that Jesus died for our sicknesses too. He took our infirmities. And that Paul said he had an infirmity. And he prayed 3 times that it would be taken away, and it wasn't. In fact, Jesus said to him, my grace is sufficient for you. My strength is made perfect in your weakness. And Paul said, therefore, I will rejoice in my infirmity. So Paul didn't know anything about this business of if you don't get healed, you don't have enough faith. He found it something to rejoice in once he knew the will of God in the matter. He wasn't sure at first, so of course, his will was to be healed. But when Jesus made it clear to him that it was not his will to heal him of this, but he had something else in mind, something better in mind, that his grace would be sufficient for him, then Paul said, well, then I'll rejoice in my infirmity. And sometimes that's what we have to come down to. I don't think you have listened to my lectures on the Word of Faith movement, have you?
No, I just found you on the radio.
Okay. Well, let me suggest that you go to my website, thenarrowpath.com. Have you ever been there?
No, I've heard you talk about it. I just haven't gone there yet.
Sure. Well, if you go to my website, thenarrowpath.com, and you look on the tab that says topical lectures, there's hundreds and hundreds of them, but it's easy to find the ones I'm talking about because it's in alphabetical order. There's a set of 4 lectures called the Word of Faith movement. It's under W, Word of Faith movement. And 2 of them are about the healing aspects of the Word of Faith. There's one about prosperity, and there's one about positive confession. But I suggest you listen to all 4 lectures, but specifically the middle 2. One is called Is Healing in the Atonement? And the other one is called Healing on Demand. And both of them are critical of the Word of Faith teaching because the Word of Faith teaching is a false teaching, and it's not what the Bible teaches. It sounds like what the Bible teaches because the teachers quote a verse here or there with lifting them out of the context of their whole passage and of the whole biblical teaching. And therefore, people who are less familiar than they might be with what the Bible teaches, they hear these proof texts and they say, oh, this must be what the Bible teaches. It does not. And so I really would urge you to listen to those particular lectures on the Word of Faith movement. Again, the website is thenarrowpath.com, and you click the tab that says Topical Lectures. And by the way, you can get an app for your phone, too, that has all these things on it. It's a free app. If you go to the Apple App Store or to Google Play if you have an Android phone, and do a search. Just look for thenarrowpath.com, and that app will show up. Just take it. It's free. Download it, and you can listen to the program live on your phone, or you can listen to archives of the program on your phone, or you can listen to all these lectures that are there on your phone. Everything's free. So, again, that series I strongly recommend because it sounds like you're quite you're under a lot of condemnation because of this doctrine, and that's what this doctrine brings. The doctrine of Word of Faith teaches that you should never admit you're sick, and going to a doctor is a way of admitting you're sick, and therefore it's wrong. If you go to a doctor, you don't have enough faith, and that's a sin. And so, when people have this doctrine, and they are sick, and they don't get well, because just like other people who get sick, people who believe in the Word of Faith don't get well all the time. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. About at the same percentages as those who don't believe that doctrine. But if they don't get better, they either have to be in denial, which it's never good when your religion makes you live in denial, and say, I'm not sick, I'm well, I'm healed, when you're not really. The other option is to just feel condemned and say, I should be well, but I'm not, and it's my fault. And both of those are really bad options. So I would suggest that you get as far from that doctrine as you can, because it's really a bad one. All right? I'm sorry we can't go any longer today. I hope that helps, Melissa. And this is only Monday. We have time for Tuesday through Friday. Some of you who are waiting to go on today, call tomorrow, and I'll be glad to take your calls then. You're listening to The Narrow Path radio broadcast. Our website is thenarrowpath.com. We are listener-supported. You can write to us at The Narrow Path, P.O. Box 1730, Temecula, California, 92593. Thanks for joining us. Let's talk again tomorrow. God bless you.